Hello and welcome again to another Electronic Eremite Reviews. I'm your host, the Electronic Eremite. Today I'm going to talk about Fantasy Flight Games Gears of War. So without further ado, let's get out the pieces and have a look. So here are the pieces. Gears of War is a game by, I believe it's pronounced Cory Konieczka, and I know what you think whenever you hear that name. He's a very prolific developer for Fantasy Flight games. So you're going to think, well, there's going to be a lot of cards, there's going to be a lot of little chits, and there's going to be some amount of plastic pieces. Well, you're right on all accounts, except for there's not a whole lot of the little cardboard chits, but we'll talk about that. Now, it's based upon the kind of an interesting mix, taking a squad-based first-person shooter game, very famous, Gears of War, and making it into a much more slow and measured-paced board game, almost a tactical minis game. Actually, I wouldn't say almost. Actually, a tactical minis game that is a cooperative game. So the only thing that really goes from the translation of the first-person shooter and this board game is the theme, and that it is cooperative in a sense, that you've got a squad then to cooperate with. Otherwise, everything changes, and I think maybe that is a problem for people who are the demographic for this game. The people who bought Gears of War, the video game, are maybe not necessarily the same people who are going to buy Gears of War, the board game. I think it's sort of like a Venn diagram. There will be people who, in the middle, who will buy both, but not necessarily people who will buy both will be the entire subset there. Because they are completely different things. And the sense that this is a board game that has a sort of slow and measured pace changes everything from the first-person shooter, which of course is fast and action-packed. But the basic story is that we have an intrepid squad of soldiers here. Can you see them? There we go. Intrepid squad of nicely detailed soldiers here. We're going to be fighting the locusts in a series of different missions that I believe get progressively harder. They're not like in Castle Ravenloft or Legend of Dritz, which would be the analog for this game, where the different adventures are not necessarily always harder as you go into the scenario book, although I think they do get somewhat more difficult, but different. In this case, they do tend to get a little bit harder. Things do change a little bit. Some of these scenarios, the game is meant to be able to be soloed, and it solos fairly well. But some of these scenarios are going to be better with multiple players. So you can still solo it, you will just be playing more than one soldier. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not too hard to play more than one soldier. I will say that it's not in the same sense as Castle Ravenloft, Legend of Dritz, where playing more than one person can be a bit easier because you have everything right there visible in front of you. In Gears of War, you are going to be taking orders for your soldiers depending on different order cards. Now this is a big difference between the competitor. In Castle Ravenloft, Legend of Dritz, Wrath of Ashardalon, you can basically just do the moves that you've got, and then when you get an item, it is a face-up thing in front of you, and you can sometimes do something special. For these, everybody's going to have a hand. And what makes this a different sort of game is not only is your hand what you can do, but your hand is also your life total. So that is a weird mechanism where the more life you have, the more options you have as far as moving is concerned, and the less life you have, the less options, and the sense that every time you're using a card, and sometimes you can use multiple cards a turn, you're sort of fatiguing yourself, or you're sort of wounding yourself in this big battle. I like that thematically. It sometimes makes things a little bit more difficult as far as the choices are concerned, and I guess in a strategic sense that is a good thing. But they do different things, and some of these cards are going to be completely worthless in a solo play game. So in fact, you do get rid of some of them. You discard and draw again if you get a few that are teammate ones. For example, the ones that say 2+ means you need to have, well, it's called teamwork. You need to have at least 2 squad members in order to make that one even viable. They have a special text of something that they will do. You can also play these cards to do a particular action that it will give you at the top, such as moving, adding to your attack or defense, or that's actually, I believe, adding to your defense, and then making an attack. Now, these are sort of opportunity skills. You can discard one of these cards as an opportunity skill, sometimes during another player's turn or even during the creature's turn. So that is kind of a neat thing. You have an order card system, a hand of cards. Another thing that makes Gears of War very, very different from Legend of Dritz and Wrath of Ashardalon as a cooperative sort of dungeon crawling, or whatever you want to call this, sector crawling game, is that there is not really the same sense a scenario book, but instead you set up your dungeon, your level, whatever you want to call it, according to these mission cards. Now, there are scenarios in the book that talk about these mission cards and what's special about them. But for example, the first one that you'll do is Emergence. Now, this gets to be a little bit complicated. Some people probably wouldn't like this in the sense that the first thing you do is you look at these. You get the first card, and this is mission setup. So what you do that one first. Then when you get into the mission, you will do mission stage 1, sort of like the computer game where if you finish a level, then you go to stage 2, and that will do something different. And if you do what the flip win, you'll win the game. So you flip the card, win, something happens. This one says 0 locust figures are in play. Locusts are the bad guys. Other ones will say flip, win, all emergence holes have been sealed, and it'll tell you what to do next. So spawning new creatures and things like that. So as the stages go on, you're going to see new things flipping around. Now, first thing, what I meant by this makes things a little bit more complicated. So emergence setup. Then it's going to have the locations it gives. Now that's going to then correspond to a location deck. So then you're going to go through here, the location deck, and you're going to pick, if it says, for example, 1A, you're going to go to 1A, the 1A card. I don't know, I'm not going to dig through it, but let's just say it says 1A, then you're going to pull out the 1A card, and it's going to tell you exactly what to do. It's going to tell you which of your tiles, let's see if we can get that to zoom in, there we go. It's going to tell you what tiles you're going to put. It's going to depend what monsters you put out, what locust figures you put out, depend on how many players you have. So that's sort of a convoluted setup. It's not a bad thing, per se. It's just more of a convoluted thing where as you go along, you're going to be pulling, and then all of those numbers, 1A, 4B, whatever, then correspond to different tiles. The tiles are really neat, and they do have, there's 4A and there's 4B. These are neat tiles. They have different things on them. These are cover, which I think is a really nice mechanic for a game like this, because in Gears of War, which is different from your Wrath of Ashardalon, Legend of Dritz, you're not going to be in melee a lot. Everybody is basically the ranger character. They have some sort of gun, although you can go into melee, although it's not as common. But you'll have some sort of gun or some sort of long-range weapon. So cover, here's the longer looking tile. So cover, you can see the cover, is going to be very important. So there are line of sight rules, although they're fairly simple. I wouldn't say that they're anything too difficult. Some games have a very difficult line of sight. Let me see here where you've got the line of sight ruler that you get, and it really is fairly easy to tell if you're in line of sight or not. And cover will change line of sight rules, but it's no big deal. But cover will give you extra defense. So it's nice, you can automatically hop into cover, and that will be a way to prevent yourself from being shot at as easily and taking a lot of damage. And so that is something that is really different about this game. Another thing that is really different about this game is that instead of having your just general skills like you would in Wrath of Ashardalon, Legend of Dritz, you're going to have weapon cards. They're going to be different things. Some people start with different weapons. There are different weapons basically you will pick up because you'll find weapons throughout the level. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't, depending on what level. Some levels you have to find the special weapon. So for example, the hammer burst. And they will tell you what their power is, what sort of damage they do. It also tells you how many of the attack dice you'll roll, and it will depend. With this one, you can always roll 2, but you can spend an ammo token that is involved with this card, and you can then roll 4. So you can get a better attack by spending ammo. And then there's also special things that come up if you roll a certain special symbol. So this one is burst fire. So if you roll this Gears of War symbol, let me show you the attack die. So you've got a Gears of War symbol here, and then you've got damage ones. There's 2 damage, there's 1 damage, and there's nothing. But you're mostly going to hit something. That's what makes this game quite a bit more bloody. And then you will roll off against a creature, or they will roll off against your defense. And your defense is nice red die here. So you've got little shields. And sometimes you have nothing. You have a lot more nothings on the defense. And then you have 2s and 1s. So what I'm saying here is that it's quite a bloody game. And for example, you might have different weapons. Some weapons won't have anything. You can't do anything with them, like the boom shot, unless you spend the ammo token. So that's kind of neat. You do have a resource management system here. And there are different sidearms, like pistols, and then there are bigger rifles. There are flamethrowers, and all sorts of things. And like I said, you don't always, sometimes you'll start with a few things. There are also shields that will improve your defense. There's like a mortar, which is really long range and rains down all this power. But then the range of them is also on the side here. This is range. So the flamethrower, for example, is a very short range, whereas you've got a mortar is a bit longer range, and you've got these sniper rifles, which are even longer range. And like I said, it does 2 dice, which is not too big of a deal, or 5 dice, and then it has a special headshot thing that can happen where you can nullify defense. So that's really kind of neat, where the different weapons are going to give you different effects, and you can then be really specialized. And of course, your different squad mates too have abilities that will make certain things more attractive to them than others. Some people start with, most all of them start with the Lancer, which is your just regular rifle. This guy starts with a shotgun. And the special abilities, for example, this guy can move an additional area when you resolve an order card. So he's a little bit faster. You've got other guys who don't discard the order card from your hand to activate equipment or pick up drop weapons, so he can just snatch up things. And so that is really very interesting in the sense that some people can specialize. I'm going to be the sniper, so I'll be really far back. I'm pretty fast, so I can catch up with you guys. You be the guy with the shotgun, really low range, but you have to run up right in front of them, and you can do a ton of damage, and you can soak up some of the damage that they do while I'm sniping them from the back. So that's kind of neat. And of course, you have grenades that you can throw, and that is also something. Ammo is tracked, by the way, while I'm talking about it, on nice little ammo tokens. And that's really your only token other than the grenades and then the wound tokens. But wounded tokens, since the cards are your wounds, they're only for the bad guys. And that's also an interesting system. So your bad guys, let me show you the cards, they all have sort of a Boolean logic that will tell you what to do. For example, these guys, now, instead of being the same as Wrath of Ashardalon or Legend of Drizzt, where every time, every turn, you're going to see your monster, whoever's in front of whatever, you assign a monster to a person, and they're going to activate. Rather than that, there are actual monster activation cards. Some people will like it, some people will not like it. What these will do is they will either activate only certain monsters, and they will do a general thing that will either spawn more monsters or activate all monsters. And it just, you will seed a deck depending on what monsters. Not all monsters are going to be available for every level. Some levels will only have, these guys here, grunts here. These might actually be the grunts, I'm sorry. There's Theron guards and Cantuses, and there are these guys here that are going to come. These are your melee fighters. They're going to come right at you. Sorry, there we go. They're going to come right at you. They also like to get into cover. So the bad guys have Boolean logic in a sense that almost all of them who are able will get into cover, so that's a really neat thing. Sometimes they also direct other creatures, so there's some really neat stuff, but it's all on these cards. For example, it says this Cantus, for example, and he's kind of your upper level. Each Cantus moves 2 areas towards the nearest cog, which is your good guys, figure, and then attacks him if in line of sight. Otherwise, you'll spawn a Cantus at an emergence hole near you. So that's one thing. But then Cantus can do other things. For example, this time, if a cog figure is within 4 range, attack him and then move 2 areas towards him. Otherwise, move 2 areas towards the nearest cog, spawn a locust. So see, they can spawn new things and direct new things or long-range attacks, so you never know exactly what the bad guy's going to do. And I like that, different from Dritz and a Chardalon, because it's a little bit of a more dynamic game. You never know. I mean, is the guy going to spawn new guys? Is he just going to lob some sort of horrible grenade-like thing at me? Is he going to blast me? Or if he's the giant big brute guy, is he going to just bust through and rip off my head, which happens quite a bit with the giant big brute guy. So all of this comes together in a much more dynamic, but then again also much more complex game than the Dungeons & Dragons style ones that you see from Wizard of the Coast. You have different weapons that you can use, you have different dice that you're going to be rolling, and that does increase some of the fiddliness. And one of the things also that you're either going to love or you're going to hate, when it comes to the bad guys, it's sort of feast or famine here. When you hit them, they have 2 states of being. They're either healthy or they're wounded. And when they're wounded, how much life they have, quote unquote, is on their card. So for example, this Theron guard, he gets 2 attack and he has 3 wounds. So in order to kill him, you have to roll 3 wounds. And, well, you have to roll more than his defense by 3. So if you roll 6 and he rolls 4 defense, you've wounded him, but you've not killed him. So what you'll then do is put a wounded marker underneath his figurine. Now, then it will change. So, for example, if he was a 3, now this is not the Theron guard, but if he was a 3, I think these guys are actually 2. When they're wounded, now they suddenly only have 1 wound, which means you only have to go over their defense by 1 to kill them. So it's a very different system where if they started out with 3 life and you didn't quite hit it, then you will reduce their life by a set amount, and then that makes it easier to kill them in the future. But you can still always go under. You can't they only wound once. So once they're wounded, if you still keep going under, it's kind of like they're just shrugging it off and bleeding some more, but you eventually will kill them. So that's either going to be something people really like because it's a neat mechanic, or something people really hate because it's a little bit feast or famine. If you just have bad rolls so that you're just enough not, you can keep things that are wounded and tearing you apart, but they're not dying. So I think that's something that will be very subjective depending on your perspective of the game. So I've shown you the pieces. I haven't shown you everything. I like to keep them. It's just enough stuff that you can fit all of your guys and almost all of your cardboard chits in a nice Plano box like this. So I think that was a really good storage solution for me, because then you really don't need a whole lot. There isn't a whole lot of stuff in this game. That's a little different than, say, Mansions of Madness and some of the others like Descent, which just you have to have an entire tackle box to hold that. So let me go ahead and clean this up, and then I'll talk to you about the game a bit. Well, Gears of War is definitely an interesting game. It is a very good tactical minis game, in a sense, that you can play solo, or that you can play with small groups of friends, and it doesn't take a huge amount of time, although I believe it's a little bit more difficult and also a little bit more time-consuming than Wrath of Chardalon and Castle Ravenloft and Legend of Dritz. Now, those are actually kind of long games. So this one can be also pretty long, and again, you're shuffling, there's a little bit more fiddliness, there's the wound things that you're always going to be using, there's your ammo things, so there is a bit more fiddliness than those, and you know, Wrath of Chardalon, Legend of Dritz, and Castle Ravenloft are fiddly games, I believe. There's a lot of tokens, there's a lot of cards. There's more cards in Castle Ravenloft, Legend of Dritz than there are in Gears of War. So don't go thinking that this one is just all full of cards and things. No, 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 no. That's not true. There's actually far less components here, but they are a bit more fiddly in the sense that they work in a complex manner. you have the location cards, you have the mission cards, and one activates the other that then talks about the tiles. So that's needs to be streamlined. I'm sorry, there just needs to be a bit more of a streamlining. It's not quite as bad as Mansions of Madness because that one is very difficult to set up, particularly for your keeper there who's putting all the things out. So it's not quite as bad as that, but it is a little bit over the top in the sense that it could be easier, I think. I think maybe it didn't need those mission cards. You could have had just a scenario book and been just as fine. But anyway, as far as a tactical minis game is concerned, it is pretty cool. It's got cover, it's got different weaponry, it's got strategies for your bad guys that are not predictable. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to move 2 away, and he only moves 1, so I know I'm going to be safe. That's sort of the Castle Ravenloft Wrath of Ashardalin thing to do, is you look at the Boolean logic and you make sure that you don't apply to whatever that monster is going to do, so you escape them from attacking you. That's not so easy here in Gears of War, because you have that deck where you're going to pull. You don't know exactly which of the Locust figurines is going to activate, and you don't know exactly what they're going to do. So you can, in a way, think about it, and then you can read the cards and predict by that. But there's a sense of uncertainty in the way the bad guys are going to respond. So I like that. It's almost like playing against an actual person. That's a little bit more of an AI than just the Boolean logic. To think of it as a bit better programming. Now, there's definitely some problems with the game, and that's not... The order card thing does throw me a bit for the players, where your life and your cards are the same thing. It's a little complex because you still have to sit there and think, okay, my life cards and my order cards are the same thing. So every time I do something, what if it's just to move 1 space? Well, that means I'm fatiguing myself. Now, you do get to draw cards, but you're fatiguing yourself, so you kind of want to make sure every act is extremely efficient. The other thing that makes it also a little bit more difficult are the order cards have at least 2 different things, and sometimes more than 2 different things. So there's the text on the card that tells you what you can do. But then there's also the icon at the top left-hand side that gives you another thing that you can do. And when I played, I always found that players were forgetting that icon. Oh, wait, I could have discarded one of my order cards to do a special attack while that locust ran by me. Well, that would have been really useful, and we could have killed that locust and he wouldn't have ripped my face off. So that was something you had to not only think about the text on the card, which is, they're not exact, some of them are very easy, but other ones are not so much, like, move up to 2 areas, gain 1 ammo token for 1 of your weapons. So you're keeping track of your ammo on the weapon, you're keeping track on each weapon, you're keeping track of what weapons you have and what abilities you have with that, you're keeping track of your character abilities, you're keeping track of the order cards being your life, and that the order cards have something they can do on the bottom in the text, but also some sort of special thing you can do on the top. There's a lot to keep track of. It is not a game like Wrath of Ashardalin where you can just say, okay, I can move 6, every turn, because no, your movement is determined by what's on those order cards. You can always discard and do standard actions, but I almost found that those discard to do standard actions, that was fine, but I was always giving up my life and some sort of special ability to do a standard action, which was difficult. And then, of course, you have the other special ability up at the top. So I found that the order cards were very confusing, and there's so much to keep track of, you had to sort of think about it in a way. Now, for those that like the more hardcore tactical minis game, that's a good thing. That means there's more strategy than your Dungeons & Dragons style game like Castle Ravenloft, where you're only going to have a set number of things. I've got my 6 move, I'm going to roll, I have to roll this to hit, I have my item that does this, gives me a plus in this, and I've got my special abilities. So I think it's a bit more of a complicated game, and that will not appeal to everybody. That will certainly not appeal to the people wanting more of a streamlined, quick game that you can play in about an hour and not have to overly brain burn. And particularly since these cards, because again, they are your life and they do many different things, some of them affect your teammates. And you can also play them to activate different actions on another person's turn. So there is this cooperative piece that is also more complex than just your regular Dungeons & Dragons style adventure. I would put this closer to the Descent style of gaming, where you really have to talk about the strategy as a whole, as a group, and what cards you have in your hand, and what abilities you can use. And then, of course, when a weapon drops, you have to talk about who wants to get the weapon and who's best for the weapon. There are major differences in your characters, so that is going to have an effect as to who wants to grab that weapon or not. So yes, the game is a lot more complicated, and in a sense a lot more than it needs to be. It could have been streamlined, and I think it's okay, because if it was because as easy as the D&D ones, then why would you buy Gears of War? So this does appeal to a different gamer. It does the same sort of game, but it appeals to a different gamer at heart, or one that wants something like that, but a little bit more on the complicated side. Also, the long range aspect of this game, everything is long range, is going to be a big deal. You're going to have to come up with that different sort of strategies. You have to think about line of sight and cover. So more complicated, again, when you're adding those things in. So I would say that it is, in a sense, almost over the top. There's a learning curve here that is going to be more difficult to overcome. So once you overcome it, you'll decide whether or not the base game is good for you. I like the game. I think it's a very good tactical minis game that can be played solo. So if you're really looking for a tactical minis game where you have a squad and you want to be able to play it solo. Now, like I said at the outset of this, because those order cards are in your hand and your health and they're hidden, playing this as a one-player, solo player, playing two different squad members is a little less satisfying, because you have those different hands to manage. I would put that on par with playing Last Night on Earth. You can't really play that solo very easily, but playing Last Night on Earth when you're playing all the 4 players as a one person against a one-player zombie, if you're playing like a 2-player game and you're getting 4 different characters, it is sort of like that. We've got those hidden cards and you have to manage those hands. But in this sense, it's even more critical you manage those hands well as the solo player, because it's also, if you mismanage them, then the person dies. And once you lose a COG member, the game is done. So you can't really lose a COG member and survive. Sometimes that's all you need to it. If you're just getting knocked out 1 or 2 people, then it's done. Other times you have a chance to revive them, but it's very rare to see a game go on where you're starting to lose people. Once the ball goes rolling, I think the locusts can really overcome you very quickly. So it's very difficult. I would say this is a very difficult game. I don't know if it's Ghost Stories difficult, but it's fairly difficult to win the game. That's what I'm finding anyway. And it may be that I'm just not very good at managing all of my different skills. So I think it is a bit difficult. The other big caveat I have is I'm not exactly sure who this game is for. Of the Dungeons & Dragons crew, I already have the 3 Dungeons & Dragons game. The video gaming crew who like Gears of War, like I said, there's probably a subset of people who like Gears of War PC, people who like these type of games, and maybe that smaller group in between that like both. So I'm not sure. The theme did not appeal to me at all. I didn't necessarily think that I like the theme, and okay, I like the theme. That's wrong to say that. The theme did not bring me to the game, as in I've never played the Gears of War game. I like the nasty guys with the different ammo and the blood and the guts and the gore. But I could care less. They could have been Space Marines and Tyranids. They could have been anything. I could care less that they were Gears of War. I didn't play the game. I don't understand the story. The story's lost on me, and there is some in there. So that didn't bring me to it. So like I said, I'm not sure exactly who the theme is for. I might have been even better if it had been set in just sort of a generic, although Fantasy Flight Games does have some of the Warhammer licensing. I think it would have been better had it been a Warhammer game, but I'm sure Games Workshop did not want that to happen. So whatever. I think it could have been okay as a Cthulhu game too, but then again, I'm always looking for new Cthulhu games. So the theme did nothing for me, and I'm just wondering who this is for. Lastly, I would say that everything's pretty good quality, but it does seem a bit sparse. So yeah, okay, the thing about having those location cards in the maps, and the mission cards, the maps are not like Castle Ravenloft where you're going to have something new every time, even on the same scenario. You're going to have the same basic tiles. They will change, and you're going to have the same basic scenario. So once you've played through those scenarios, I do see it being a bit more limited. It's not quite like Mansions of Madness where the limitations are very clear, where if you have 5 scenarios and you have 3 different ways that can go, yeah, so the scenario is maybe different, but the map is always the same. It's not quite that bad, but it is definitely going to be a little bit more limited than your Castle Ravenloft, Wrath of the Shardalon, where you can seriously play those different caverns over and over and over and over and over and over and over, and have just pulling the different random cards for the different bad guy, and then be satisfied. I mean, I've done that. That's what we basically play in Wrath of the Shardalon. We just do the chamber cards, and we just love that. So that's not what you're going to see here in Gears of War. The other thing is that the grittiness of the board game and the grittiness of the theme makes this a far more limited game. You're probably not going to want to play this one with younger kids, whereas you could play Wrath of Shardalon, Legend of Drizzt with younger kids. I wouldn't say hugely young kids, because the monsters are fantastic. There's not a lot of blood, guts, and gore shown. There's not a lot. I mean, let me just put it this way. Let me grab one of these cards. There's blood dripping off of one of these cards. Do you see it? Blood here. On this side, there's blood dripping off the Gears of War symbol. There's blood everywhere. Everything's gritty. You know, ruins and disgusting ruins on there. You've got the creatures are horrible, and that's fine. They're not quite. They're more horrible than the D&D creatures in a sense. But you're just not going to want to play this with people who aren't going to like the gritty thing. The gritty atmosphere. My wife would not play this game. She doesn't like guns. She doesn't like ammo. She doesn't like blood, guts, and gore. She wouldn't like being some sort of marine in a space setting. It's just not going to happen. So she will play Legend of Drizzt. She will play the fantasy thing where the swords and sorcery, where the elves are beautiful and everybody looks perfect and there's magic and things like that. So it is the theme can be a huge difference. So I'm going to say that Gears of War is a much more limited game, and it's one that's probably not going to hit the table as much because there's going to be people who just are turned off by the dripping blood, by the ruined atmosphere, and by the guns rather than swords. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at Gears of War. So all in all, I believe it is a good game, particularly for those that like guns over swords and those that are familiar with the PC game, but there's more limitations to this one, and it's a much more fiddly game. So thank you for joining, and I hope you shoot yourself some locusts in the future. I'm the Electronic Eremite. Have a great day.